Where Did the Wind Go? Art by Drunken. Story by Benjamin Heisler. I was not aware of the Joel Coleman before his visit to the museum. At the time, ethical practices regarding collection materials were being redefined, and sorcerers who performed black magic weren't typically admitted to the ivory tower. I could not have understood that this questionable administrative decision would hence curse me with this narrative and transition my role from assistant to apprentice. Beginning, I was employed as an object handling technician who was paid by the hour. I became entangled with Joe Coleman when asked to retrieve and store an artifact in preparation for his arrival. I learned that Coleman is a painter and a prominent collector of memorabilia linked to murder. He employs psychometry, which purports to transfer knowledge about an object's past through contact with its energy. Coleman implements this technique to paint portraits of disturbed and violent individuals. At the museum, he was interested in a breastplate connected to a man who was killed by hanging at Fort Saskatchewan, following an event of cannibal psychosis. Discredited academic discourses attributed this scenario to what was called Wendigo psychosis. Coleman intended to paint the hanged man's portrait. He would go on to say that it was important for him to connect spiritually with the subject. This strange scenario suspended belief and piqued my interest. I had never prepared relics for a necromantic event and deemed it a novel experience. Moreover, I was allured to explore this paranormal truth that seemed stranger than fiction. But first, there was a job to do. A wizened co-worker and I made our way to retrieve the breastplate. The foggy display case was in a secluded room where the projected silhouette of a young, long-dead RCMP officer voiced his dreams. My fellow technician was long in the tooth and adorned with numerous talismans. He glowered warnings when I speculated, so we're just going to let this thing out? Together, we placed 2 sets of heavy-duty aluminum suction cups and attempted to remove the case front. The case resisted. I leveraged with my elbows and pulled with all my strength. The display case gasped. I froze, like prey alerted to a predator. Dust billowed, and the case took an awakening breath. As the clouds settled, we set the case front aside for a better view of the item. The breastplate was small and rectangular, made from animal hide, sparsely beaded with a strap. Holding it in place were 2 gigantic claw-like plexiglass clips. It was clamped down, almost as if someone didn't want it to escape. Together, we worked to remove it from confinement. We then placed it on a rolling cart in a white microfoam tray. I rolled the cart into the storage department and went about other business. I had dismissed my colleagues' fears as superstition until I returned a day later to discover the cart was missing. There was a red spatter trailing across the floor nearby to where the item had been. Surely the relic had not manifested its gruesome history. I resolved to risk that I might play the part of a second meal, and with the earnest nobility of a casual employee, I set off to find the cart. I followed the Crimson Trail and discovered both cart and artifact tucked safe in a side storage aisle. My investigation would lead me to learn that a painter had become startled while performing touch-ups on the red emergency lines along the ceiling vault. In the weeks that followed, the winds howled fiercely. Windows blew off buildings, and debris fell from construction sites. I found myself at a polling station in a daze after a tumultuous week of weather. I became vaguely aware of a child in line reciting again and again, "Where did the wind go?" The words might have been a question, but they were spoken as a statement. Equally perplexing, the wind hadn't gone anywhere. A strong breeze spun leaves through the hall's entrance. The child's parent was vacant and unresponsive. Where did the wind go? Where did the wind go? Where did the wind go? On the day of Coleman's visit to the museum, I did not take part in the tour or ritual. But while performing my duties, I caught a glimpse of him walking towards me down a long corridor. He looked like someone who had emerged from a distant century, and his long coat billowed as he drifted down the hall. There was no dramatic howl or chill in the air. The day was uncomfortably still. It would be years before I discovered images of the painting that was synthesized from this event. I was disturbed by what I saw, and I could not shake the feeling of participation in something sinister. I became increasingly driven to understand what had happened, further resolving to learn everything I could about Joe Coleman. To understand him as an artist, I reviewed interviews, his artworks, and his performances. His subjects were often serial killers, and his performances included elements of carnage. I dare not share the most disturbed of my findings. I could not understand why Coleman had been granted unfettered access to the museum collection. Almost enchanted, I wanted to know. Then, like a haunted character who cannot avert fate, I did the unimaginable. I reached out to Joe Coleman. He responded with interest, and on request, I shared with him my story of peculiar events surrounding his visit. In return, I wished to ask him a series of questions. Coleman agreed to the pact, and I was quick to pounce. As if possessed, my questions demanded blood. I wanted to know about his experience with the object. I wanted to know about his sorcerer's artistic persona. I wanted to know if he was a fraud. Coleman declined to respond. Along the way, trusted friends and mystically aligned consultants had advised me to avoid those dark places. I took it to heart and decided to drop the story. I welcomed the release and tried to move on, but devil in the details. I carried the weight of our unfulfilled bargain. Owed or owing, we were tethered by debt, and the fine print included no clause for escape. I was dragged back into the story when fate delivered an opportunity to learn more about Coleman and his reason for rejecting our agreement. To explain the next turn of events, I must share that during my earlier period of research regarding Coleman, I discovered an uncomfortable tie between him and myself. We enjoyed some of the same music. Coleman was friends with two musicians I admired, and he had painted their portraits. On an evening, fate brought one of these musicians to play a gig in a local brewery. Following a full moon episode of fevered mania, I found myself in conversation with the musician regarding the circumstances of his portrait with Coleman. Thinking back, I should have felt fear and shame the moment a staff member introduced me as the cannibal ghost guy. Instead, I embraced the moment. My predatory fixation could not be suppressed, and as a writer, I could not help but chase and dine. I asked about his experience with Coleman. His words rang like simple truth, and he was quick to warn. You have to understand, that guy is surrounded with dark energy. He spoke without blinking, while glowing with a tired, white light. You can't be near those kinds of things without being made of part of it. I assumed that Coleman's artistic persona was performance, but the musician corrected me. It might have started that way, but the effect of that dark energy is real. With the aura of an exhausted angel, he offered to help enable communication with Coleman, but I would never pursue the promise. Years later, when I saw the musician perform again, he dedicated the show to curses and the lifting of curses. I recognized a couple with whom I had conversed about this story years earlier. Approaching them, I shared my appreciation for the dedication because I was still working on the same story. I mused that I was likely still cursed. Their confusion was infectious, and like a monster with 3 heads, I ran off into the night. I had surely lost my mind by the time I reached out to the museum to discuss the appropriateness of Coleman's collection access. My inquiries were initially met with denials that called to question my sanity and the veracity of my experience. It was later conceded that these events transpired and that Coleman's access to the collection was not appropriate. However, I would learn that my journalistic engagement had taken me too far. In pursuit of this story, my work became the same, not appropriate. I would be shunned by policy thereafter. Even then, past the haunting of consequence, I wouldn't let it go. Why else did I come this far? Adjusting the albatross around my neck, I ventured on. Beyond reason, in ignorance of danger, I devised a scheme to enforce the debt and resolve the business. I connived to send Coleman a message that was laced with numerological power. I had come to know him, and I knew that it was a language he respected. I crafted my message and patiently waited for the appropriate day, hour, and minute. After sending my communication, Coleman's response was immediate. He offered a window of time to complete the interview. Agreements were made, and dates were chosen. But the day came and went, and I could not bring myself to confront notions of old magic or cannibal ghosts. The hunger was past, and I no longer craved answers. Something had resolved, and our transaction was complete. I found myself pondering the journey. It was as if I had awoken from an insane dream to find a trail of destruction. Had I traded years of life and sound mental health in exchange for some sort of sad wisdom? The answer sat uncomfortably. Even still, past disillusionment and terrors, I was trapped. I couldn't give it up. I couldn't move on. I couldn't let go. My hands were tied, and the noose was fixed. My single-track mind streamed ahead like a train at full tilt. Coleman was entrenched, and our conversations continued with and without cooperation. I twisted like someone trying to escape a straitjacket until a local art gallerist offered to help find a home for this story. For a long time, I had considered this narrative and my experience to be too deranged to share. Could I simply write it all down and have the obsessive monster go away? Perhaps, but I had lost sight of reason. Further, I was submerged in the gray morality that comes along with advocating for the devil. It is damning to reflect that Coleman's work fixates on individual anti-saints with religious intensity, and the same can be said about my written journey. I looked him in the eye and saw myself staring back. It was as if I unfolded his ritual and muttered words I didn't understand, and there was no path forward but to follow instructions and complete the rite. Coleman implores to make the monster your friend. It could destroy you unless you let it out, or unless you possess it and put it on the wall. I wrote with a frenzy and signed my name. I wonder if I let it out. I wonder if it's on the wall. I wonder when we meet again.